All right, and hello, and welcome to today's webinar for what is new in TestRail 7.4. My name is John Reynolds, I'm TestRail Product Manager. So I will be going through all of the new features in the latest TestRail 7.4 release, which is focused on single sign-on and multi-factor authentication. But before we do get started, I do just want to cover off a few housekeeping announcements. This webinar should take about 30 minutes. We are recording the webinar, so if you have to leave or anybody else on your team did register for the webinar but can't make it, they should still get a recording link within about 48 hours after the webinar ends. If you do have questions throughout the webinar, please use the Q&A panel in your Zoom console. Try not to use the chat channel, but instead the Q&A panel, because that allows us to better track the questions that do come in. And also, please just try to keep your questions to the topic of what is in this release. Questions relating to general TestRail features or other items may drive the webinar longer than it should be. So just try to keep your questions to anything specific to this release and anything I discuss here. With that all being said, let's go ahead and get started here. Let me clear my throat real quick. All right, so the agenda for today is we're going to cover the major features that are in this release, the major updates. So with this release, we've added multi-factor authentication. We've made some single sign-on enhancements for enterprise customers. So any enterprise customers who utilize single sign-on or are interested in utilizing single sign-on, we've made some updates to greater expand the functionality there. And we've also made a few API changes to support some user management. Following all of the information I cover, we'll have some time for some live Q&A at the end. So first things first is multi-factor authentication. So with TestRail, we've now added multi-factor authentication. So what does this mean? We have added a layer of security to all TestRail instances, both professional and enterprise. Which, when logging in, you will be prompted for providing a 6-digit secure code. This code is a one-time use code that will be sent either by email or provided through an authenticator app if you have one configured. You can enable multi-factor authentication for the entire instance. And also on specific users. So if you have a user which is, say, an API user that you don't want to worry about multi-factor authentication because they're never going to actually log in through the UI, then you don't have to turn on multi-factor authentication for that account. But when enabled, like I said, you will be prompted for a one-time use code for every new session. So every browser session that you log in, you will be prompted to use multi-factor authentication. The code is provided by email by default, but you can use an authenticator app as well that uses a standard TOTP algorithm, which I'll show you in just a minute here. A quick note though, when multi-factor authentication is required for users, then API requests must therefore use an API key. Currently, the API accepts either an email address and password or an email address and API key. If you have multi-factor authentication enabled, that must be changed. Any API request must use the email address and API key. A password will be rejected. If you are using single sign-on, then TestRail's multi-factor authentication cannot be used for users. So any multi-factor authentication would be handled by your identity provider and not TestRail itself. So to enable multi-factor authentication, you can enable it in the instance under the site settings as an administrator. Site settings security, you can turn on multi-factor authentication by just checking the box highlighted here on the left. And on individual user accounts, you would then go in and choose the users which you need to require multi-factor authentication. You should be able to do this through individual user accounts, but also by editing users in bulk. So after going through the standard login screen, you're just going to see the prompt for entering a 6-digit code. There's not a whole lot. This should be pretty intuitive and common with most any other application that requires multi-factor authentication. You just enter the code provided by your app. So here's an example of the email that you would receive. So if you don't have an authenticator app configured, you would use this email code. And this code by email is valid for 30 minutes. Codes through an authenticator app are usually 30 seconds. So, but the email code, you do have a little extra time. But that email should be sent once you try to log in. If you have an authenticator app configured, you will not receive this emailed code. So with this multi-factor authentication, we've added, this should support any general authenticator app, such as Authy, Google Authenticator, Microsoft Authenticator. Any app which uses a time-based one-time password algorithm should be compatible with TestRail's multi-factor authentication. So the apps listed here are some of the most common ones, but you could use any algorithm or application that uses the TOTP algorithm. So as a user, if you would like to connect an authenticator app, if you go to My Settings page, there is an Auth tab, which allows you to just connect your authenticator app. If you click on the Connect button, you will be provided with a prompt. This prompt gives you a QR code, which you can scan from your mobile phone if you are using the application on a phone. If you have the application somewhere else, say on your PC, you can use the secret key to then also do the connection and configuration. Once you have configured the app, you just need to enter a 6-digit code that's provided just to verify that the app, the algorithm, is in sync with TestRail. So that's pretty much all there is for multi-factor authentication. It provides an extra layer of security for your TestRail users and your TestRail instance. So now let's take a look at a few of the SSO changes that we've made for TestRail. So these enhancements, there isn't a lot to show in the test. There really isn't anything to show in the TestRail UI, since these are just enhancements to existing functionality. So if you're interested in single sign-on, you don't have enterprise already. If you look on the Gurok website at our documentation for single sign-on, you can see how to configure single sign-on for any protocol. But with this release, we've just added support for 2 new protocols. So now we support OAuth 2.0 and OpenID Connect. So previously we've supported SAML 2.0. We've now just added a couple extra protocols to help more companies connect their IDPs to TestRail. We've also added some additional security to SAML 2.0 by supporting encrypted assertions. So when configuring SAML 2.0, you have the option to enter your key for your encrypted assertions for TestRail to use there. We've also added a guide for connecting Active Directory federated services. I'm pretty sure that's what ADFS means. We've added a guide for connecting ADFS using SAML 2.0. So now it's a little more tedious process than just connecting to a SAML 2.0 standard application like Okta, but we have added that guide for configuring ADFS. And important to note, once again, single sign-on is for enterprise customers. So if you are interested in enterprise, you can just reach out to our sales team or your support team, and you can discuss upgrading to enterprise. So now the final major update for this release are changes to TestRail's API. There are a number of changes that we've made to make it easier to support user management, permissions management, project management through the TestRail API. So you can now, using the TestRail API, create new users, update existing users, assign user roles, assign user groups, and then also assign user and group access to specific projects. Previously, the TestRail API only supported getting a user information, we've now added a lot of endpoints for managing users, managing permissions, all through the API. So you can now synchronize group membership. So if your IDP has user groups and you want to synchronize those user groups between TestRail and your IDP, you can do that by with a custom API script. You can also automatically create new users. So if you have a workflow that requires adding a new user to TestRail, say you hire a new QA person, you can implement that type of automatic user generation into your workflows without even need to log into TestRail. So let's take a look at some of the API changes overall. So we've made updates to the Get user endpoints, the Get project or Get projects endpoints, also update project. We've also added a number of new endpoints. So 8 new endpoints exist. We added the add user, update user, get group or get groups, add group, so you can create a user group, you can update the user group, delete a user group, and you can get the list of roles for your TestRail instance. So for the user endpoints, we've added some new fields to responses to support some of the additional functionality. So we added an email notifications field, indication whether or not the user is an admin. We've added a group IDs field, which is an array of group IDs that the user belongs to. We added a multi-factor authentication required field, so you can just tell whether or not multi-factor authentication is required for that specific user. For enterprise customers, you can also see an assigned projects and SSO enabled fields. So these indicate whether or not SSO is enabled for the user, and also the projects to which a user is assigned, and this would apply to project level administration, which was released a while ago for TestRail. So like I said, the assigned projects and SSO enabled fields are enterprise only. And it is important to note that deactivating users is not currently supported via the TestRail API. You can create new users. However, if you need to deactivate users, this would still be need to be done through the UI at this time. So here's an example of the get user response. So anything in red or blue was added to the response. Red applies to all subscriptions, both professional and enterprise, and blue applies to just enterprise, as I mentioned a moment ago. So we just have a couple of Boolean fields and then the arrays for group membership or assigned projects. For project endpoints, we've added a few new fields as well. We added a default role ID, so you can see the default role permission configured for the project. We've also added the default role name. It just corresponds to the ID, but the name just helps with usability, so you don't need to pull the API, the roles endpoint, to determine what the name of the role is, so you can just see it immediately. We've also added the groups array. When the groups array will be just an array of objects containing the groups in your instance and the role permission assigned to those user groups. So you'd see the ID of the user group, the role ID, and then the name of the role, which is assigned to that user group permission. And then we've also added the users array. So the users array will include an ID of each user in your instance, the global role ID assigned to that user role, and then also the project role. So the project role information would be what specific permission you've assigned to that user within the project. So most of this content will just mimic the access tab of your project interface. But this allows you to now manage user permissions for projects. So you can automate project access. If you need to assign a user to multiple projects with different permissions, you can do this using project or user or project endpoints. So an update to the Get project response here. So we have a default role ID and the default role name. And then we also have the group and user objects as shown here. So all of this data should be consistent for each, or for the Get project endpoint. So So now let's take a look at update project. So in update project, we also supported the ability to update group membership within the project, or group access within the project, and also user access in a project. So if you need to assign a user specific access to a project via the API, you can now do that. You can also change a project's default role access. So if you have a lot of projects and you need to update multiple projects and change the default access setting for dozens of projects, you can just write a quick API script to make that change. So now let's take a look at some of the new endpoints. For users, we added the add user endpoint, which creates a new TestRail user. We added the update user endpoint to update an existing user. So this supports modifying all of these fields for any user. So you can change the name, email address, the user's global role, turn on email notifications or turn them off, set them as an admin, assign group membership, enable multi-factor authentication, require multi-factor authentication, and then also assign projects or turn it on or off single sign-on. As a quick note, go back real quick, all of these endpoints are available for both professional and enterprise. Only the fields which have an asterisk and are denoted as an enterprise only are enterprise only. Any of these other updates do apply to all instances, both professional and enterprise. So another set of new endpoints we added were the group endpoints. So you can get information about a specific user group. You can get information about multiple groups, and you can also add a new user group. You can also update or delete user groups from TestRail as well. The general functionality would be you'd get your ID of your user group. The user group would have a name, and then you would have an integer list of users which belong to the group. So if you retrieve a group information, you would get the ID, name, and then the user list. If you use get groups, you would get an array of all of the user groups in your instance. If you add a group, you would just submit the name and then the users that you want to be included in that group. Same thing with update. So these endpoints just make it a lot easier to manage your user membership in groups, especially if you're looking to synchronize them with an external database, such as your IDP. Finally, we added a get roles endpoint. This is just a single endpoint that will retrieve all of the user roles that you have configured in your instance. This will give you the ID of the role, the name of the role, and whether or not this is the default role. It's important to note the permissions list for roles will not be included here. Providing that information via the API wouldn't be a very user-friendly experience. We would just suggest naming your user roles accordingly to match the permissions that you've assigned to them. But if you need to manage the permissions for your roles, this still needs to be done through the UI. All right, so that pretty much covers all of the functionality of the TestRail 7.4 release. So let's go ahead and take a look at some questions that we have. One question we have from an anonymous attendee, which I just referred to just a moment ago. Are all the endpoints also available for professional version, or do you need enterprise? All of the endpoints are available for enterprise except for a few fields. And does Jira Integration work with professional, for example? The TestRail for Jira Integration works with any TestRail instance, professional or enterprise, does not make a difference to the Jira integration.
Hey, John, this is Matt from the TestRail team. We had one of the users on our call here ask just to confirm that TestRail can be integrated with Okta's SSO, or TestRail SSO supports Okta now. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, TestRail has been able to work with Okta since single sign-on was first released. So we should have guides for configuring TestRail with Okta for SAML. And with the new protocols for OAuth and OIDC, we should also have guides now added for configuring any of the three protocols. So Okta should work without a problem. Okta, I'm not quite certain what the correct pronunciation there.
I just dropped, I think we just published a new guide for this in our documentation earlier this week. So I dropped that link into the chat if anybody is looking for that as well. And then another user had asked in the chat for API-based users, I think you might have mentioned this earlier, but just to confirm, how do you need to integrate the TestRail API to avoid MFA? If you've enforced MFA for your TestRail Cloud instance, what do you need to do with the API users to make sure that that's not a blocker for them again?
So when you configure and require MFA for your instance, you still need to specify the users that will use it. So a user will not be required to have MFA unless you have enabled it for that specific user. So when you're updating your users, you would just not apply MFA to that one account.
And then there was something else about using the API token instead of using a password. Is that right?
Yes, if multi-factor authentication is enabled. A second here. Can you see my TestRail instance now?
Yeah.
Okay. Just move some stuff out of the way here. So here under my settings, so if you go to my settings, then the API key section, you can just create an API key here. You just give it a name, generate the key. Then you would copy this key because it's only going to be showed to you once. Hit add, and then save your changes. And that will give you an API key to use for any API requests. But I'm not going to say, you have to make sure you hit save, otherwise the API key will not be saved. So I am not saving the API key because I don't need it.
Great. I think we already answered a question about whether MFA is turned on by default. But just to reiterate there, MFA is not turned on by default in your instance. You actually have to enable that. Is that right, John?
Yes. And one of the reasons for that, especially for, say, TestRail server instances, if you don't have a mail server configured, you would essentially lock out your users as soon as you upgrade. So once this release is available for TestRail server, could cause a lot of problems for anybody who doesn't use a mail server for TestRail. So.
That makes sense. And then in terms of the ways that users can authenticate if MFA has been turned on, is there any option to authenticate via text message, or what other, just to confirm, what other methods are available for authentication?
So authentication would either be by the emailed code or a connected authenticator app. We don't support text messaging right now, or any kind of SMS message. But currently, so you would use either your authenticator app or the emailed code. But the authenticator app should be available on pretty much any mobile phone, which would be very similar to really getting a text message.
Great. I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat. If anybody else has any last minute questions I wanted to ask about MFA or the new SSO implementations, just let us know here. Otherwise, one thing I'll say too, just from the TestRail side, we will, in the follow-up email for this webinar, we'll include links to the new documentation around some of the expanded SSO functionality. That way you can have some quick links to that. So look out for that email. And typically we're able to send that follow-up email. It will also include a link to the recording in the next 24 to 48 hours. So John, I'll pass it back to you to wrap up if you have anything else you want to share.
Yeah, I just know that this multi-factor authentication has been a long requested feature, so we're happy to implement it and really help TestRail, help just check off that security box that a lot of customers may may have. So it'll be very helpful for every TestRail instance. And I'm just happy to get some more functionality out to our users. And yep. But I appreciate everyone's attendance and questions, and we look forward to any other questions you may have. Just reach out to us at contact@gurock.com. Thank you, everyone.